In this video lecture, we're going to discuss formal and informal reports. What are they, and how can you put them together? Let's start by contrasting formal and informal reports. Formal reports usually are on fairly complex issues with many moving parts. Informal reports, though, are narrower issues that are more simple. Accordingly, formal reports are going to have a lot of highly detailed information, whereas informal reports, they may have very detailed information, but at the same time it's not going to be as much information. Formal reports are often very long. These things can be hundreds, if not thousands of pages. Informal reports, though, are usually pretty darn short. A single page, maybe 2 pages, is a very common length for an informal report. A formal report will follow a common and fairly fixed structure. Usually. Not always, but usually. Informal reports, they have all sorts of possibilities for structures. Formal reports are prepared by experts and professionals, whereas informal reports are done by a wide variety of people all across the world and in many contexts. Formal reports are for wide audiences. They can be individual people, they can be groups of people, they can be government agencies. Informal reports, though, are usually done for very small, narrow ranges of people. Often just 1 or 2 people will get informal reports. Let's talk their functions. Informal reports are usually used to make recommendations, determine feasibility, and provide evaluations. What do these things mean? Recommendation is, as you may guess the word meaning, hey, we've looked at the situation and here's what we think you should do. You should do blank. A feasibility report, on the other hand, is going to look at a situation and say, hi, we've looked at this situation and it looks like you want to do this. It's going to work, or no, it's not going to work. An evaluation is something you're going to look at a situation and say, hi, we've looked at this, you've done this thing, and yeah, it's working, or no, it's not working. These are the big 3 that are most common. If you look at the literature about reports in the professional literature, there are all sorts of different ways people describe these things, all sorts of specific situations, but these are the big 3 that are often used. An informal report, on the other hand, is going to be used for all sorts of things like explaining what happened, what are the test results, what is the procedure we're following or followed, what happened in our lab test, in our lab experiment, what did we do? How is the big project coming along? All sorts of other possibilities. The formats that reports follow can be very different as well. Informal reports are going to appear in all sorts of different formats. For example, memos are very common. Letters, emails, oral presentations, PowerPoints, fill-in-the-blank forms. These are just some of the possibilities, the more common possibilities of informal reports. Formal reports, though, they often take the form of one of these 3 things. A printed and bound document. For example, a full-on book. Could be a spiral-bound book, a comb-bound book. It could also be a website. You find reports on websites all the time. Also, fully functional PDFs. These things that look like professionally bound documents, but they are done up in electronic format. Who prepares these things? Informal reports can and are be created by just, well, all sorts of people. You've probably done some as students. So we have a fake student here looking at, it's supposed to be a chemistry lab. Well, you've all taken a lab science of some kind at some point in your life. You had to fill out a lab report. What did we do? We added so much of A to B, applied heat, stirred, etc. Alright, that's an informal report. People with jobs that require dealing with the public have to fill out informal reports all the time. So the lifeguard, what did he do? I pulled somebody out of the water. Here's what happened about it. Or I had to give first aid to this person. Or I had to restock the first aid cabinet because we are out of blank. All these are informal reports. Business people, they have to do informal reports all the time. So, yes, hi there, travel department. Here's my travel request. Here's how much money I need for my trip. Here is perhaps after I'm back from my trip. Here are my receipts. Here are the contacts I made. Also, your mom. She fills out informal reports all the time. So, for example. Dear beloved husband, your daughter did this today. So that, for example, is an informal report. Point being, Informal reports, all sorts of people all over the world do these things all the time. Formal reports, though, they're usually done by experts, by professionals. They're people with specific subject knowledge, and they also have the ability and skills to wrangle the technologies to make these formal reports look professional. The audiences for reports. Formal reports, they often go to multiple varied audiences, whereas informal reports go to narrower and specific audiences. Here's an illustration that'll help illustrate what we're talking about. Let's say that we want to build a nuclear plant right across the Cobb Parkway from Kennesaw State, Marietta. We're going to take down the old bowling alley that's there and put up a nuke plant. Okay, great. We need to write a report about this, undoubtedly. So, who is the audience for this particular report? Well, there would be the people who live nearby, the other business owners who are nearby. There might be Kennesaw State University itself. We might be the students at Kennesaw State University. We might be talking about the city government of Marietta, the county government, Cobb County. Seeing that perhaps the state of Georgia might want to report. The federal government might want to report, and particularly the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. You can see that a big report like this would go to all sorts of possible people. What about a particular small system in that big nuclear plant, though? Let's say that under construction, one of the engineers discovers that, well, we're supposed to have 7 valves, but it appears only 3 came on the truck. We need to order more. So this engineer will write off to her boss and say, hey, supervisor, it looks like we got the wrong number of valves, so here's what's going on. We need to order more valves. Please order one for us. Well, gee, that's an informal report. Would that necessarily need to go all the way up to all these other audiences we talked about for the big report about building a nuclear plant? No, of course not. So the formal report can go to all sorts of people. Informal report has a very smaller audience. Let's talk informal reports. These things are often unstructured, or they follow fairly simple and repetitive structures. In particular, we in this class are going to talk about progress and status reports. These are something that you're going to have to probably do a lot in your life, and you're going to have to do one for this class. So we're going to talk in particular about structure of these things, the organization pattern, what you need to do to represent the schedule, and good ways to represent visually what's going on in terms of progress and status. Let's talk structure first. Most progress reports have a pretty simple and generic structure that you've likely encountered somewhere in your life before. The introduction, the body, and the conclusion. Yes, I know. You're wondering, why don't you ever say anything new? Well, the big deal here is that the specific contents of a progress report are going to depend on the purpose of the report. So let's talk about the introduction, body, and conclusion. We're going to ignore the body for just a moment and focus on intro and conclusion. The intro, you want to talk about the topic you're writing about and why you're writing. Does this sound familiar? I hope it does. You're also going to forecast what's coming up in the main body of the report. And preview the conclusion. Please remember, a progress report, and matter of fact, any kind of report, is not a mystery novel. You don't want to hold the solution back until the very end. Instead, you want to put it up front so that the person knows at a glance, what is this? What am I reading? What do they have to say about it? And then you can backfill from there in the main body. The conclusion, you're going to summarize the contents and make sure you follow the report's purpose. I've read far too many reports in my life that have started with A, gone to B, next step is somewhere between D and E, then it goes to R, and then the conclusion is out there in double Z. What? Make sure this thing follows a path all the way through. Let's talk about the main body of a progress report. There are one of 2 patterns that I recommend you use. One is a time pattern, the other is a task pattern. I'm going to differentiate these 2 things and explain how they work. A time pattern means you're going to discuss the things that are going on in the project in chronological order. What happened first? What happened second? What happened third? Then a task pattern, on the other hand, you're going to break down the project into separate individual tasks inside the big project. Then you're going to talk about those in any logical order you want to. So let's use an illustration of, say, digging a ditch. What's involved in digging a ditch? You need a place to dig the ditch. You need to make sure you're digging the ditch in the right place. You're going to need supplies to dig it. You're going to need a crew to dig it. You're going to need to feed to that crew. So, accordingly, let's talk about time pattern. Well, first what we did is we went out and found a place to dig a ditch. Then we hired a surveyor to come in and lay out the ditch for us. Then we went to the store and bought a whole bunch of shovels. Then we went to the employment agency and hired a whole bunch of people to come out and dig the ditch for us. You can see how this goes to A, B, C, D in a row. At the same time, does that matter a whole lot to your reader? Maybe it would make more sense to say, well, there are issues involved with setup than there are issues involved with actually doing it. So the task pattern, you might break it down into prep work, such as prep work for the land, finding a place and getting a surveyor. Then there's prep work involved in just buying the supplies. So talk about buying the supply, all the shovels. Maybe you also want to talk about buying all the food for the crew and preparing the lunch wagon for the crew. So you could break this down to task patterns, and you could talk about each of these tasks individually instead of just first, second, third, fourth, especially if a bunch of these things are going on at the same time. When you're talking the schedule for a progress report, you always want to talk about what is going on, where are you in the project. Talk about what happened so far, what's happening next, what are your milestones. If you're not familiar with the word milestone, what it means is it's a measurable goal. We expect to get to this stage by this date. Well, are you there yet? This is a way of measuring your progress. Are you ahead or behind schedule? If you're behind schedule, what's your plan for catching up? You always want to be honest, no matter what, because if you are not honest, then this will happen. Your boss will not be happy, and you may lose your job if you lie. So, if you are ahead of schedule, fine, fantastic, cool. If you are on schedule, excellent. If you're behind schedule, it could be a serious problem, but it's better to know it and say, here's what we're doing about it, than it is to ignore the problem and hope it goes away, because it probably won't. When you're talking the schedule, it's a good idea to include a Gantt chart. A Gantt chart is a visual representation of what is happening in a project and when it's happening. We've talked about these things before, but I'll lead you through one just as a reminder. On the left, we've got the various stages of the project. Here are the various tasks. Across the top, we've got a timeline. Then, we've got a whole bunch of bars that show what is happening and when is it supposed to finish. For example, this particular thing right in the middle, the fourth bar down, formation, it's supposed to start on the 11th, and it is supposed to end after the 12th. So it's a 2-day project. We start here, we end there. Notice in between where the split is, that is the today mark. So if this thing were being turned in a progress report, this progress report would have been turned in on the 11th. As we look at it, we say, oh, okay, we've got the darker blue coming from the left. That is showing that this particular task is half done. It looks like right on the split of today, yes, we are exactly on schedule for this. If we look back at the second one, the analyze and development, then we've got that thing, well, it was supposed to start at the 8th and end at the end of business on the 9th, but it looks like it's not actually done, so we're behind schedule on that part. In summary about progress reports, always set the scene, tell what's going on, what has happened, what is going to happen, organize the body according to a time or task pattern, discuss your schedule, and write a relevant conclusion. Next up, let's talk formal reports and how they fit together. The standard parts for a formal report, standard parts I should say for a feasibility and or recommendation report, you can use it for all sorts of different types, but what I'm going to give you is really good for these two. You start with your front matter, you go to introduction, the problem definition and description, a technical background, decision-making criteria, an options section, a comparison section, conclusions and final recommendation, and any back matter. Let's break this down individually and talk about what goes into each of these sections. To begin, let's talk front matter. You may recognize this, and matter of fact, I'm showing you a PowerPoint of a PowerPoint because this should look really familiar. This is the proposals slide that you've seen before. It is exactly the same stuff. The big difference between the proposal front matter and the report front matter is that you're going to preview the report's conclusion in the letter of transmittal and in the executive summary and/or abstract that you turn in. Again, remember, your report is not a mystery novel. Clue in your reader to the conclusion as soon as you can. The introduction section. Well, notice we're saying proposal, proposal. Well, guess what? Change those words to report. It's the same thing. Justify. Why does the report exist? Tell your reader, hey, this is the report. Here's what it's about. You remember you hired us. Here's what we're going to talk about in the report. And here's how it's all going to be laid out together. That is because you want to remind your reader, she or he hired you, and hey, remember us? Yeah, you hired us. We're going to give you a report just like we had promised. And remember, you're going to pay us now? Yeah. So this is what we're talking about. Also, in the introduction, I will repeat this again. Preview the conclusion. Let your reader know what did you decide in the end here. Let them know up front and then backfill for the rest of the report. Problem definition and description. You need to remind your reader why she or he is reading your report at all. What is the problem? Why is it a problem? Why does it need solving? The size of this section can vary tremendously. For example, is it a single audience you're writing to? Is it multiple audiences you're writing to? How much does your audience know about it? If you have an expert audience that's very narrow, then your problem definition description will have to be very short. If it is possibly a very, very wide audience or multiple audiences who don't know much about this thing, you're going to have to explain in some detail. The technical background. The technical background section is where you explain what's going on here. Is there anything that the people who are reading will not understand about the subject? It's an optional section. If your audience is a bunch of experts, then you're all good. You don't have to worry about it. If your audience is very, very wide or is a novice audience, then you will have to explain things. So as an illustration, this picture here, what is this? Oh, it's a dam. It's a fish ladder. Well, you may be wondering, what is a fish ladder do? I didn't know fish could climb ladders. They don't seem to have arms or legs. What exactly? So if you're talking about this and your readers don't understand, you need to define what is the deal. What is a fish ladder? In this particular case, what a dam does, as you all know, is it seals off the water from upstream and downstream, and it lets some water out at some point. Well, how do fish get upstream? For example, how do salmon get upstream to spawn to their original places where they lived? Well, if the dam seals it off, they can't get up there and the salmon will all die. So they provide these things called fish ladders. It's essentially a side stream that fish can go up, and it's a little pool. Fish hop into one pool, fish hop in the next pool, fish hop in the next pool. That's what a fish ladder is. So if we were talking about this, we would probably have to include a technical definition or technical background section that would explain this idea for all of you. The decision-making criteria section. This is where you define and describe the factors that impact your report's conclusion. In other words, what would make you say, yes, this is an option I will pick. You got to make sure that these factors relate to what your audience is concerned about. For example, cost, schedule, popular opinion, demonstrated needs, quality. These are just some possibilities. There are many, many possible criteria. It's your job as researchers to figure out what is important to your audience and what is important to making sure that the thing works or doesn't work. This is where you define those things. The next section is the options section. For a recommendation report, describe the various possible options you're looking at. So, in this case, apples and oranges. Why are these options viable? What are they? Why are you even looking at them? What is each one of them going to require? Make sure you don't compare them yet. You're just laying them out, saying, okay, we have apples. Here is about apples. Here's what they are. Here's what they do. Here's why they might be desirable. Here's the deal with the apples. Here's how they'd work. You would just talk about these. Once you've done that, Then, the next section, we're going to start comparing them. Don't compare them here. If you're writing a feasibility report, though, skip this section entirely. Skip options, go straight to the comparison. Comparison section is where you're going to compare the various options according to the listed criteria. So if you are talking about apples and oranges, this is where you will compare apples to oranges. If you were doing a feasibility report, this is where you would compare the ideas of good idea, not good idea. You want to organize the comparison by criteria. One good way of doing that is to use a matrix. So, for example, if we look at this matrix, on the left-hand side we've got our various criteria, and on the top we've got our various options. We then look across the grid and say, does each of these options meet the criterion? Yes, no, tell us about it. Speaking of tell us about it, you want to write a paragraph or two or three or more that explain the comparisons. Don't just put in the visual. The visual is a good aid, but you need words to help describe and explain what are you showing here, why is it important, and what conclusions should the reader draw from this matrix. Please, whatever you do, don't just make a simple list of pros and cons. That's a terrible, terrible idea. Your audience will hate it. Then you're going to bring your conclusions and or final recommendation. This is where you bring it all together. Summarize the various sections before. What have you said? What does it mean? Focus on information your reader wants and needs. Don't just start to ramble on about or say, oh, here's every single thing. No. Keep it simple. Keep it short. Make sure that this is a tight conclusion that says, here's the deal. Here's what's important. Here's what's important to you. The end. Make sure you end with a brief and clear statement of action. What should the reader do? Should the reader do this? Not do this? Which of the options should the reader pick? Or is the project feasible at all? Can you do it? Can you not do it? Is it a good idea? Is it a bad idea? Keep it simple as you possibly can. Then you've got the back matter, bibliographies, glossaries, indexes, appendices. Everything is just exactly the same as we talked about in terms of proposals. So, yeah, that's a formal report. We've given you a skeleton. Now it's your time to put the metaphorical meat on the bones. Start putting these ideas together, and pretty soon, you're going to have a full-on formal report.